Hey, what's going on? Dr. Mike here, the mad Russian scientist of metal. Today I wanna finally make a video about making your heavy guitar tones from scratch, from the rawest possible form, that is your DI, into the mix-ready, almost finalized product. And you know, I actually made a video about that a few months ago, but it was so long, I went so deep into the process that I decided to actually redo that. Look, I get a lot of questions about making the guitar sound as big and huge and heavy as we can. Even though we have so many plugins these days, amp modelers that make our job so easy, still there are a lot of misconceptions about making that tone firstly work by itself and then work in the mix. I'll go through all the details, I'll go through impulse response selection, cab selection, amp settings, and then how to fit that into the mix, and I'll try to make it more or less prompt as well so that you don't have to sit for 40 minutes and watch this blood video. By the way, while Logic has crashed and opening up, if you like what I'm doing, if you want to see more of valuable content, how to dial in the heavy sounds, please like, subscribe and share this so that I could pump up more for you. Thank you. Without further ado, let's do it. So in this video, I'm gonna use a song that has been released 6 years ago with my old band Gift of Madness. I play the guitar so I can showcase basically anything. I took the DIs, I reamped them, and I basically built that tone from scratch and fit it into the mix. But first, let's familiarize ourselves with the old mix. Just the guitars now. Alright, cool. Sounds pretty decent. Could be better, but you know, it's been 6 years ago, so. I used XFX 2 Splone Nitro model, which sounds kinda nitros. You can definitely tell that there is some tube screamer action going on so that it, you know, loses that low end and gives that mids a bit of a punch. Overall, tone is decent. Gives a lot of room for the bass and for the drums, so it all works together, but it could probably be a bit thicker and bigger. So anyways, that's what we're working on, and now let's try nailing that tone down and making it even better. The key thing about coming up with guitar sound these days, I assume that most of you would be using impulse responses, is what comes first? Tone block on your amp or your cab, or which way, and then you change the cab, the tone changes as well, so it's easy to get lost. And I was as well for some time, but then I developed this approach which I call the funnel approach to your guitar tone. And that funnel is from broad strokes progressively down to more fine and fine-tuned details, both with the tone settings on your amp and on your cab. Is you fix one settings, you don't change them, then you work on the other one. So if you say you fix your EQ on the amp, then you go and change your cab, and then you fix your cab once you are satisfied with that, and then change your amp. That's how it goes for me, and that's how I dig those tones. Let's demonstrate it just quickly. So, I have my DI here, check it out. Recorded quite hot, had hot pickups at a time, doesn't matter. Now I send it into my amp, which is this black bad boy up there. Sounds like this. Obviously without a cab. I'm using my reactive load to load the amp and be able to send amp signal straight into my Apollo here. And then I grab any cab, any random cab from my collection, right? See, it sounds kinda dull. Well, you obviously have to start with somewhat decent amp settings first, because then it just makes no sense if you have your gain low, say this. Right, if you start with those kind of settings, I mean, you obviously cannot select your cab properly. And I mean, importantly enough, every amp has a sweet spot. For most of the amps, it is 12 o'clock settings. For others, like 6505, 5150, it does differ a bit. So obviously you have to know your amp. But at least get it to a starting point where it sounds kinda where you want it to be. When it's high gainy, when it chugs, you know, when it's not too boomy and stuff like that. But don't focus on those settings too much. First, remember, we're working with broad strokes so far. Now, what do? We have our amp settings more or less dialed in. We start browsing through our cab collection. By the way, I'm using Own Hammer. Have been a fan since I started and I really love it. So let's move and check out some of the Own Hammer presets that I made. Diesel. Actually not too bad. Friedman. 2 mid-ranging. 2 hissy. Angle. That sounds like shit. Mesa. I really like this one. Yeah. This one is okay. Alright. So this sounds pretty decent as a starting point, alright? Mesa oversize. Has nice and chunky top end, and nice and chunky bottom end as well. A little bit boomy, but that's what we are obviously dealing with when working with cabs anyway, so that's supposed to be the case. Cool. Once you have chosen the basic cab configuration, now is the time to fine-tune the amp settings. Remember the funnel, fix the cab, and tweak the amp. Let's do that. I basically introduce some minor corrections, you know, make it a bit brighter, scoop the mids a bit, but not too much, you know, stuff like that. Basically use your ears and find what you like. And now we move on to cab fine-tuning. If you know the Own Hammer system, they have all these mic positions relatively from the center of the speaker cone to the side of it. Fine-tuning these positions matter. I really dislike this one here. I don't like this one either too much. When you move closer, it's too bright. This one has nice chunk, but then we need to complement it with more bite. Otherwise it's gonna be too dull. So the other speaker configuration, so we have 2 mics. Yeah, I like this one. Pretty much. So that's the basic process that you go when selecting cabs for your impulse. So once you've found your cab settings, you may go and change the amp ever so slightly if you feel the need for it, but it's normally not necessary. So your funnel has been completed. Now we need to work on our 2 tracks because, well, all the heavy guitars are left and right, quite obviously. So there's one trick that I really want to show you here, and that's super important. Check it out. So now we have our left channel here. Alright, with our right channel as well. So basically what you do, quite obviously, you stack the same cab settings in here, right? Have a listen. Sounds decent, but it could be a little bit wider and a little bit bigger. And now to do so, you grab your other channel and introduce minor change. So maybe with your microphone position, you ever so slightly move it back or forth, which I've done here. So I moved it one step closer to the speaker cone and I balanced them up a little bit differently. Let's have a listen what happens. So before, now with the difference. Alright, what I can hear is very subtle change in the mids. They start to spread out a little bit and move a little bit differently, the mid-range itself, and that's what will create a lot of width in your mix. It's very, very subtle, but I recommend experimenting with that and finding settings that slightly shift from common mid-ground for left and right channels. That creates width. Once this is done, we may start pre-mixing your guitar tone, basically sculpting it with an EQ. Well, firstly, you have a listen to the tone, alright? What do you hear? I hear boomy low end and a annoying resonance. Let's find it. There you go. Get rid of that. That one as well. These are all cab resonances which you need to get under control. High pass that a little bit. Now look, there's an important bit that I need to mention. If you high pass your guitar tone too high, see how low end gets under control now. But you lose the weight and thickness that basically all the guitarists want from their tone. They want it fat on the low end. If you do this, if you high pass at higher than 100, you will lose it. And that's one of the things that many mix engineers do in order to befriend the guitars and the bass. But there is a slightly more complicated way to befriend these and to make the guitars fit in the mix without losing that low end. Let's do that. Let's not high pass it so high. See, this is crap. It has to go. Make it dynamic. And now the low end itself, the rumble. That's the one thing that has to go, make it dynamic, and another one at in here for sure. Without. There we go. Now it fits almost like a glove. Let's compare it with the settings that I dialed in before. Close-ish. Let's listen to the others. I actually like my new ones better. Just one area needs attention, this here. Make it a bit more controlled. Yep. A few other small things that you also probably want to low pass it. Because this here isn't really pleasant. But again, if you high pass it here, your guitars lose sheen. The air, the breath of the cab. You don't do that. Just high pass them around 10 maybe. And then find those resonances at the top which you don't like. There you go. And just be really careful. If you cut those resonances too much, or too many of them, because you can enter this weird mental state of, oh, that's resonating, oh, that's resonating as well, get rid of that, get rid of that. Then your sound will become quite dull and unnatural. You will clean up the shitty resonances, but your sound will end up suffering. So just be careful about that. Once these corrections have been introduced, you're welcome to just copy them over to the other channel, listen to them both in a pair, coming together. Next step is the guitar bus processing. There is a difference on how the processing impacts the signal on a single track versus on the bus. In general, bus is more sensitive and it requires less processing. So let's do that. First thing that I do on my bus is I use a multiband compressor to tame those low-end chugs without now with. You can see that I use relatively fast attack and release just for the low end here, this region, because you want that under control. Again, if you have high passed and got rid of that earlier, you won't have this problem, but I do want to retain it. I want that thickness to carry over in the mix. So therefore I compress it with high ratio. Next up is another corrective EQ. Similar deal, you can see that, again, I high pass it again at 66, so it's a low high pass. I don't get rid of the low end too much, but progressively, by using two high passes, I just make sure that there is a bit less of that rumble going in. Now, let's listen to it without and with. So I just went across the whole spectrum and found the areas that I don't like. You can see that those cuts are no more than 2 decibels, but they make quite a difference. So it's a sensitive, as I mentioned, bus processing is a sensitive step, so make sure that you are careful with that. And this 100 Hz dynamic EQ wideband is important. Without, it almost acts as a compressor, whereas it isn't. So it progressively pushes the lows down once they jump up. It's a progressive kind of EQ. It really helps to, again, keep that low end consistent, keep that low end big, but under control. Highly recommended. Dynamic EQs are quite a must in mixing heavy guitars. From this point onwards, we're dealing with less and less important stuff. And that starts to come in handy when you listen to the guitars in the context of the mix. Let's do that and see what they're missing and what we need to add. Few things. Clearly they are too quiet, so it's not a very correct judgment. But they also are a little bit mid-rangey, which I don't like, and they lack bite. After using those corrective EQs, let's use some coloring EQ. For this I use this Electro one, which I really love on heavy guitars, but you may use basically any EQ. Logic has a built-in coloring EQ, this one here, yeah. So you can definitely get some similar results with this kind of processing as well. Doesn't really matter. Just use what you like. So in this here, I'm adding bite. You can see that I'm using some bands that, I'm using the shelf at 3.8 for bite. I'm using a bell at 1.7 for mid-range forwardness, and I'm using the low-end bump for thickness, because once you add those two, the top end and the mids, the low end disappears. And basically what happens with this EQ, you basically cut the mids because you raise all the other things. And that's fine. That's basically what we wanted. Ooh, Logic has crashed. Mint. Back onto it. Next step, and now from this step onwards, we are purely making moves that fine-tune the guitars in the mix. So what I've done is I introduced this AR1 saturator / compressor. I don't really compress the guitars. I'll show you why. See, the needle isn't even moving. Without, makes it a bit louder and more lifted, so brighter, and also saturates them, makes them thicker. Why don't I compress those heavy guitars? Well, I'll show you why. Let's have a listen in the mix with the current arrangement. Starting to come together and sound pretty decent. If I compress though, right? Without, with, these guitars just become a bit more mushed up, a bit muddy, a bit more glued up together, but I don't really need that, and I just don't really dig that tone. But that's my personal preference, alright? I use different methods for the guitars to be thickened up, and mainly saturation. There's nothing wrong in compressing them if you're after that exact tone, just not my personal thing, alright? We're getting close, so let's just knock them out of the park. Next up I use some EQ as well. You can see that this is getting progressively more and more subtle. So less than 1 decibel of a change, so I just cut the mids a little bit and a few resonances to clean up again. This one here. Just make them a bit cleaner and sit in the mix a bit more. And then I used an inflator to make them louder, that's all. Getting there. Lastly, what I like doing on my guitars is reverb and saturation. Yes, I do like some reverb on guitars, but really subtle one. Let's have a listen. High pass them quite significantly so that low end is under control. And I like this lexicon for nice character, but you can use any sort of wooden room as well. Just make sure that the tail isn't too long and then it isn't too bouncy and it's controlled. Blend them in. Without. And with. Listen to the tail when I stop. See, it gives a bit of a bounce, a bit of an extra movement, but it's so subtle you can't almost feel it at all. So that's quite important. And then finally I saturate them quite heavily with tape compression. Have a listen. That's my favorite kind of thing. In the mix, without. For hugeness. You can use different sorts of saturation here, maybe some mic pre or maybe even some compressor in parallel if you want to. Smash it hard, make sure that the tone is preferable. In this example here, I'm not a huge fan of the low end. It's okay, but it could be better. So I would probably spend a bit more time tweaking this if it was the real mix. But anyways, let's have a listen in the mix now with all that processing and see what you think. Original guitars. Sounds like a joke. Still don't like the mids though. Something is weird. Let me check quickly. this range here. It's a bit better. Look, that's about it. I'm not pretending this to be the very final sound in the mix that I would use, but it's certainly mix ready, and by showing you these actions and approaches, I'm pretty sure that I was able to cover the basics for creating that thick and meaty guitar tone. Now, again, as I mentioned before, this doesn't really matter in terms of a plugin or amp. The approach is identical, especially with the selection of the cab and with the EQing as well. The cab itself plays such a big role in the tone, you would be surprised. So make sure that you use that final approach next time. Broad strokes amp settings, broad strokes cab settings, fine tuning the amp, and then fine tuning the cab, and then maybe another round of fine tuning needed, and that will definitely give you the results you're after. Thanks so much for watching, cheers and rock the on!